Very well. Good morning. It is a pleasure to get started with this activity, which is one of several that we have been planning in conjunction with the ILO, specifically with the Southern Cone. I would like to particularly thank, on behalf of the government of Uruguay and the Commission, Fabio Bertanu, Director of the ILO for the Southern Cone, and Sarah Rasavi, Director of Social Security of ILO, for being with us. The previous century, of course, was one of Social Security and of employment. Full employment became a core target of all governments, and that perhaps was clearly demonstrated in the second Beveridge report, Full Employment in a Full Society in 1944, which says that misery generates hate. It's a very brief mention there, but what Beveridge was getting at that point was the importance of employment in the second half of the previous century, not just as a matter of survival, but also as a way of participating in prosperity. Employment, we could also expect that it is also a key element in terms of people's employment. The 21st century came in with a series of changes, of circumstances, and some of those we're familiar with in this region, such as informal conditions, although Uruguay is one of the countries with the lowest rates of informal employment in the region. It is still at about 25%, and this is certainly a matter of concern. This century has also led to some changes in terms of the use of new technologies that can lead to automation and many different circumstances, which may constitute a threat to employment in addition to the opportunities that it poses, as well as new forms of employment. The use of digital aspects and techniques, as many workers say, my employer is an app, and that certainly is a real challenge for employment, particularly in our region and especially in Uruguay, independent of the fact that we have non-contributive pension systems that have been in place for over 50 years. In any case, we are very much interested in hearing about the European experience, the experience of other countries, to see what we can do to be able to reform better. So we are very grateful for this opportunity, and we look forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you, Rodolfo. For me, it is a pleasure. I'm Fabio Bertranu, Director for the ILO for the Southern Cone. I will speak very briefly to give the floor to our Director of Social Security in Geneva, Sarah Rasavi. I would like to thank Mr. Mieres, the Commission, and Rodolfo, of course, who presides over that commission, as well as all the commissioners who are with us, and the trust placed in the ILO to be able to support you and bring forward some elements that, for a country that has one of the most notable levels of Social Security development in the region, it has always been the spirit that has inspired the reforms and social dialogue that has been a core aspect in Uruguayan society. Therefore, it's a pleasure and an honor for us here at the ILO to be able to support this and to bring together this panel of experts to give you some thoughts, some ideas on some of the things that are happening in the labor market, particularly vis-a-vis these transformations that pose particular challenges to Social Security coverage. Without further ado, I will give Shada the floor, and I would beg your indulgence. This is the first time we're doing a bilingual seminar. Let me thank our interpreters who are with us here today as well. So we'll switch, we'll have an English language channel, a Spanish language channel. You can click on the globe where it says interpretation at the bottom. If you're hearing the interpreter, you've already done that. And we'll have two presentations in English, a couple in Spanish, and we will also be broadcasting in both languages on our YouTube channel. So Shara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fabio. And I want to thank in particular Rodolfo Salden and also thank all the members of the Commission for the invitation to be here with you in this really important meeting and one that I've been looking forward to. Can you hear me? Hello?
¿Estamos escuchando? Sí.
Yes. Sorry, can you hear me or was that not audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. I thought I heard that you couldn't. Okay, very good. So as I said, this is something that we have been really looking forward to being in this meeting with you. And as Fabio already said, Uruguay has been always a world leader in terms of its social protection systems, and within that, obviously, pensions in particular, and has been incredibly effective in combining different mechanisms to really create a system that balances universal coverage with adequacy of benefits and also the sustainability of the system, financial, economic, political sustainability of the pension system. Now, the Uruguayan system is also in compliance with the international social security standards, as the country has managed to consolidate a multi-pillar system that really upholds ILO's principles, which are embedded in a number of conventions, in particular conventions 102 and 128, as well as in recommendation 202. So, with that kind of experience that you have in the country, it is obviously a real honor for us to be supporting the Commission as best we can. But also I have to say that I think this is also a bit of a challenge, as the questions you're asking and the issues on which you want advice are issues that we're also grappling with. They are a challenge for many countries around the world, and it forces us as the ILO to kind of go beyond our comfort zone, if you like, go beyond the current best practices and to really look for solutions that will be effective. And as Fabio also said, we are here really to serve, to mobilize the global networks that we have of experts and policymaker to really be able to help you and to strengthen Uruguay's social protection system, which is, as I said, often the social protection system that in our work we point to as a front runner and a best practice for other countries to look at. So we are really following the conversations that you're having very closely and with great interest. And as I said, being a front runner in social protection policy, you are likely to be pushing the frontiers with the kind of solutions that you're going to come up with. And you will be informing the ILO and also many countries, not only in the Latin America region, but also beyond, on how to really be able to create a pathway for universal, adequate, and sustainable pension systems that are inclusive of all women and men, regardless of what type of employment they're in. So let me not take up any more of your valuable time and just wish you all the best and say that we're listening very attentively and look forward to the very substantive discussions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Shara, y muchas gracias por el apoyo del departamento.
Thank you very much, Shara, and thank you also for the support of the Social Security Department for this activity and for the Southern Cone. Let me just quickly introduce our panel. We will have 3 presentations. The first by my colleague, Christina Berhardt. She is the head of the social policy area in Geneva. She will be mapping out the vision that the organization has with regard to these dynamics and these challenges in coverage in social protection, and particularly the contributive pensions for these workers that are in non-standard work arrangements. Next, we'll hear from Luz Rodriguez. She is a good friend of the ILO and of the Uruguayan institutions. I believe she's visited Uruguay on several occasions. I remember, in fact, being there with her, I believe it was last year, and a group of Social Security and labor attorneys. She is a professor at Universidad de la Castilla in La Mancha and has broad experience most recently in the regulations and coverage of Social Security for digital platform-based workers, but also has a broad range of experience in other fields as well. We will then hear from Sabina Lasoga, who is an expert in social protections from the European Observatory. And she has been working very actively in systematizing and providing follow-on to the changes and the innovations that are happening in regulations in Social Security for the non-standard workers and self-employed workers. So she will be giving us a comparative overview of the situation that is what is happening in Europe and the debates that are ongoing in that area. So therefore, without further ado, let me give the floor to Christine, and who will be making a 15-minute presentation. And I will let you know when there are 3 minutes left, and then we will have 2 different presentations, again, 20 minutes each by Luz and Silvina. So Christina, the floor is yours.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Fabio. And let me just try to share my presentation. And I would also like to join Shara in thanking the President of the Social Security Commission, Rodolfo Sardain, and all the members of the Commission for really having this opportunity to have this exchange with you on this very, very important topic. And as Shara has already sketched out, and as Fabio had mentioned earlier, I think we are, I mean, Uruguay is certainly not the only country looking at these issues. There are many other countries looking at it, and actually many countries are looking to Uruguay to find solutions, because I think Uruguay has so far really had a very good experience in solving and addressing some of those very important challenges. And so, and actually, I mean, as we know, it's not only the challenge of digitalization and automation. I mean, we are currently in the middle of a huge public health challenge with the COVID pandemic, which has actually revealed a lot of the challenges that are related to the fact that a large share of workers and the population at large are insufficiently covered. But then we have also the broader challenges that are related with the globalization, with demographic changes. We know that there is still a lot to do to address gender inequalities, rising income inequalities in many parts of the world, and obviously also the big challenge of environmental and climate change. And I mean, all these the different changes, they really necessitate a transformation of our economies, of our societies, of employment. And these obviously have very strong implications also for social protection systems. And now looking specifically at what is sometimes called the new forms of employment, which actually resemble in many ways the old forms of employment that we've been struggling with, in the sense that there are forms of employment with regard to who are in many ways also quite precarious. So I think it's really important to look at these different forms of employment where we have these challenges together. And what is often called the non-standard forms of employment. With that, we often look at temporary employment, at multi-party employment relationships. So this is, for example, temporary agency work, and part-time work, on-call work, which is also very common when it comes to looking at the types of work which are mediated on platforms. But obviously also we have a huge challenge when it comes to disguised employment and dependent self-employment. But I should say also that the definitions of what is considered as non-standard forms of employment sometimes vary. It's not always exactly the same definition. And then we have the other category, which is a large category where we talk about self-employment in general. And that obviously includes also what we call the genuine self-employment, so where people are not in disguised employment or dependent self-employment. And for all these categories, obviously, we know that in many cases the Social Security coverage is lower than for other types of workers. And we also know that in many cases also the adequacy of benefits is a challenge. But we also recognize that in many countries, it's not, I mean, sometimes this is being discussed as if all workers in those forms of employment were excluded. And this is certainly not the case in many countries, including in Uruguay. And also in many countries of the European Union, which will also be addressed in the other presentations later on. I think one critical discussion, and I think this is sometimes a bit the elephant in the room in this debate. There has been a debate in some quarters about decoupling social protection from employment. And I think looking at this debate, I think sometimes, I think it's important really to disentangle that debate. And because there is sometimes quite a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to what is actually the linkage between social protection and employment. And looking at different forms of social protection and the way how they are linked to employment. And as you can see here on the slides, there are 4 ways to make things a bit simple, how social protection can or cannot be linked to employment. Some forms are linked to a specific contract. For example, I mean, looking at severance pay, or looking in many countries, they have kind of employer-sponsored health insurance, for example. And this, as we can see, for example, in the debate in the United States, this is a huge issue. Because if people lose their job, obviously they lose the social protection that comes with it. And this is definitely a huge challenge. Then when it comes to social insurance, the situation is a bit different, because the link to employment is not the link to a specific contract. It's a link of being economically active. I mean, sometimes in some countries, this is more linked to being an employee. And also this creates difficulties when it comes to the coverage of self-employed workers. In other countries, and I think, I mean, Uruguay is more in that category, it's more inclusive in the sense that it includes at least some categories of the self-employed. So it's linked to economic activity as such. And then we have a set of benefits which are linked to residence. And this is here we are talking mostly about tax finance benefits, which can include either the universal type of benefits like child benefits or universal pensions, or means tested benefits like social assistance. And then also in the discussion, sometimes there is a discussion also when it comes to the role of individual savings and private insurance. And sometimes these are being discussed as possible solutions to changes in employment. And although there might not necessarily be a very kind of strict link to be an employee, for example, or being economically active, in theory, everyone could have a private insurance or everyone can save. But obviously, the capacity for people to save and to pay the premiums for private insurance obviously is very much linked to their economic activities. So only those who actually have a sufficiently high income are actually able to use those mechanisms. So their capacity is quite limited. And I've listed here a number of key principles that can help us really in discussing the capacity of those different mechanisms and different types of protection, and really addressing the challenges of the future of work. And I mean, first and foremost, this is certainly the question of universality of protection. The capacity of those mechanisms to cover workers in all types of employment. But then obviously we will need to make sure that the benefits are adequate, that they are portable. And I think in the current discussion on the future of work, the portability is a very important issue. That benefit rules are transparent, that there's accountability in the system. Obviously, gender equality plays a very large role, and good governance and in that respect, and also being sure that the benefits and the way how the system is administered really helps the population in actually having trust in those mechanisms. And so when it comes to looking at the types of social security or social protection that which are better placed to really support countries in making the necessary transition and adapting their systems to the challenges of the future, I think there are two main the pillars for the social protection system that is most or best geared to address those challenges is actually a social insurance, but a social insurance which is inclusive, which doesn't just cover employees, but covers workers in all types of employment, including the self-employed, also to be able to support labor market mobility. So where people move from one sector to another, when they move from being an employee to being self-employed, vice versa. Sometimes they combine dependent employment and self-employment. The more inclusive a system is, the better it is able to really accommodate those challenges. But obviously, so even, an inclusive social insurance system is certainly an important point. But we also know that we need tax-funded benefits to complement and to cover those who cannot be kind of sufficiently covered by social insurance, or to provide a kind of a level, kind of a social protection floor, which could be universal child benefits or universal pensions. But also we know that sometimes social assistance programs have challenges because they're too narrow and they exclude many of those in the informal economy, who would need some protection. So I think there, and this is what I've highlighted here in these two arrows. So for social insurance schemes to become more inclusive, and so for social assistance to become more universal. And I think for the other types of benefits, those which are highlighted here in lighter blue, there's definitely a role in the system, but I think this can only be kind of complementary to a very strong social insurance and tax finance benefits. So, and let me just, on the key principles that can inform the adaptation of social protection systems. And unfortunately, we don't have the time now to go into everyone. But I think what is really important in this is making sure that there is universality of protection and covering workers in all types of employment, not necessarily through the same mechanisms, but through mechanisms that really help and are adapted to their situations. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But also when it comes to the good governance, when it comes to the sustainability of the system, that there are fair financing mechanisms with risk sharing, collective financing. And also I think there's not only an issue for the system itself to be sustainable, but I think there's also an important point in ensuring when it comes to the functioning of the economy, that there is fair competition and no free riding. And this is a challenge that we see in many countries where the digital economy somehow is free riding on the traditional economy. And I think Social Security has an important role to really create a level playing field in that regard as well. So just very,
Cristina,
yes, yeah.
3 minutes.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm actually going to skip some of the slides that I have, and I just want to introduce that to you, and I know that you have a version of that slide before you. This is basically, I think there are certain features of social protection systems that are better able to face and address the challenges of the future of work, and I've listed them here. This is part of a review that we have done among many countries, and actually I think that Uruguay actually has got already many of those features, in the sense to make sure that at least for the large majority of the population, there's mandatory coverage. There's a kind of a common system. There is strong risk sharing. There has been a lot of work to simplify administrative procedures, also using digital technology, and really have an integrated policy framework, also using the fiscal space which is available, find a good balance between contribution and tax financing, and a broad and well-informed social dialogue. And I think these are really some of the features which we consider as very, very important for addressing the challenges of the future. So let me just skip some of those slides, because I know that this will come back later on in the other presentations. So let me just skip over that and come right to the framework which was agreed in the ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work 2019. And this important declaration has actually, it discusses the very important role of social protection for addressing the challenges for the future. And it uses 5 attributes for social protection systems: universal, comprehensive, adequate, sustainable, and adapted to the world of work. And I think these 5 attributes are really key in thinking about ways to improve and to strengthen the pension systems, but also the social security systems as a whole. And finally, and this is my last slide, I think what is also important in this endeavor and in building universal social protection systems for the future of work, what is important really is, on the one hand, to really see how the social protection system, how the social security system can be improved. And I think there is a lot, there is a lot of things that can be improved in the system, to really making sure that the system is well prepared and adapted for the future of work. But at the other hand, I mean, it doesn't function in a vacuum. So in order for the social security system and the pension system to function well, it also needs to be linked and complemented by effective labor market regulations, so which is also important. And I think one specific issue where many countries are struggling is the correct classification of employment relationships, making sure that disguised employment relationships are being prevented, and ensuring also that employers really take their responsibility seriously in ensuring the social security for workers. And this is indispensable for ensuring a level playing field, also for enterprises, and preventing a race to the bottom. And obviously social dialogue plays a very important role in that regard as well. And then there is a last kind of piece of the puzzle, and I think this is also a very important one, and this is very essential in moving forward. And I think Social Security and also the pension system in itself can play a very important contribution to that, and in one hand, but it also benefits from good policies in that regard. And this is really the social investment for life and work transitions, where the social security system plays an important role, but also other policies to making sure that there are gender responsive policies to support life and work transitions. And this is where we look, for example, into lifelong learning, where we look into active labor market policies, employment services, access to healthcare, child and long-term services. And these are really important also to make sure that for people that they can actually have basically enjoy decent work throughout their lives, because we know that in many cases, for example, when it comes, in many cases, women face challenges in really pursuing a career. So I think making sure that these policies are in place are also important. And finally, also an overall conducive policy environment with macroeconomic policies, trade and competition policies, tax policies. So I think it's really important to think about the whole picture of policies, both when we think about what can be done within the social security system, but also what needs in other policy areas, and how the two really kind of mutually interact. And I think I'll stop here, and I'm happy to respond to any questions later on. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Cristina, por mapear esta introducción.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for mapping out this introduction.
Y
for making this tie-in with the other institutions in Social Security that help to explain the situation in our countries. For our commissioners and the audience, these presentations will also be translated into Spanish and will be posted on the Commission's page as well, I imagine. So let me now turn to the presentation by Luz Rodriguez, who will be talking about non-standard working relations in terms of digital platforms and so forth.
Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. La verdad es que es un auténtico honor estar hoy con todos ustedes. Estoy muy agradecida a la OIT CONOSUR, a Fabio Bertranú y también al Comité de Expertos en Seguridad Social del Gobierno uruguayo y al propio Gobierno uruguayo por haberme invitado a estar hoy con todos ustedes. Vamos a hablar de un tema del que...
I'd like to address a topic
Perdonen.
That...
Perdonen un momento.
Just one moment.
Bueno, antes de iniciar
Before
mi conversación con ustedes sobre qué deberíamos hacer para mejorar la protección social de estas nuevas o no tan nuevas formas de empleo o de empleo no estándar para ser más exacto, me gustaría compartir con ustedes el inicio de todo, el inicio de la seguridad social. No crean que por hacer un alarde de erudición por mi parte, que no es mi intención, sino porque buena parte de lo que está sucediendo en este momento a consecuencia del avance de la revolución tecnológica o de la digitalización sobre la protección social tiene que ver con la configuración misma de los modelos de seguridad social, de los tres fundamentales que pueden ver en mi slide, y de los principios en que están basados esos tres modelos. Repaso muy rápidamente. El nacimiento de la seguridad social en el mundo está vinculado al principio del mérito, es decir, se cotiza, se recibe. Crece o nace a finales del siglo XIX, vinculado al mundo del trabajo. De hecho, hay unos grandes estudiosos del modelo bismarckiano, que es el modelo continental europeo, pero también el modelo expandido por buena parte de los países latinoamericanos, decían que este modelo fue creado para evitar que los trabajadores de aquel momento, los trabajadores alemanes de aquel momento, pudieran caer, decían los comentaristas, en las redes de la socialdemocracia y del comunismo. El segundo modelo que nace en Europa es el modelo que nace después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, en buena medida como contribución de los millones de trabajadores que lucharon junto con sus países en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. También está vinculado a los riesgos del trabajo, el desempleo, la enfermedad o el accidente o la jubilación, pero fundamentalmente porque Beveridge, que fue quien firmó, no hizo únicamente él, pero sí quien firmó aquel primer informe sobre el modelo de seguridad social, entendía que lo peor que le podía pasar a alguien era la pobreza, y que la pobreza estaba motivada por la causa del empleo. Este modelo está basado en la idea de la necesidad. Uno es pobre o tiene necesidad económica y percibe una prestación de protección social por parte del Estado. Y el tercer modelo, que es el modelo nórdico, que nace también en la primera mitad del siglo XX, vinculado fundamentalmente a las ideas socialdemócratas, que es un modelo completamente distinto, está basado en la idea de la igualdad, y sus dos principios fundamentales es que es un modelo universal y que es un modelo financiado con cargo a impuestos. ¿Por qué empiezo por este primer recordatorio? Por dos razones fundamentales. La primera es para subrayar que la intensa ligazón que existe entre el empleo y los modelos de protección social, y por lo tanto, sobre todo en los dos modelos, el modelo bismarckiano y en el modelo fundado en Beveridge, y por lo tanto, como les decía, todo lo que suceda en el mundo del empleo afecta directamente al mundo de la protección social. Si estamos en un momento de un impacto de la digitalización muy fuerte sobre el mundo del empleo, nos podemos esperar efectivamente un impacto muy fuerte también sobre los modelos de protección social. ¿Y qué efectos está produciendo la revolución tecnológica sobre el mundo del empleo? El primero es que, no voy a entrar ahora en las cifras, pero si quieren podemos entrar después cuando hablemos o cuando debatamos sobre el tema. El primero es que, más allá del cálculo concreto de cuántos puestos de trabajo van a perderse o van a ganarse a consecuencia de la tecnología, lo cierto es que parece haber un cierto consenso porque hay un importante número de puestos de trabajo que hoy ocupan los humanos que van a perderse para los humanos, y que por lo tanto el volumen del empleo puede reducirse en los distintos modelos. También es verdad que en función del avance de la propia tecnología. Bueno, si un modelo de empleo y un modelo de protección social están unidos, y el modelo de protección social depende de la cantidad de empleo, si el empleo decrece, hay que preguntarse qué pasará con el modelo de protección social. Y aquí hay dos debates fundamentales en el ámbito de la Unión Europea que estamos siguiendo y que podemos hablar después más largamente sobre ellos. El primer debate es: ¿tendrán que cotizar a la seguridad social los robots, sustituyendo la cotización de las personas?
contribute to Social Security as a substitute
habrá un
to
momento en que el
people,
empleo dejará
or
de ser
will there
el
be a
canal
time at
a través del que
which
se distribuya la
employment
riqueza
will
económica
be the
y
grounds on
deberemos
which economic
empezar a
wealth
pensar
is
en rentas
distributed,
alternativas
and we need to
como es
think
la
about
renta
then
universal
substantive
o la renta
income such
básica
as
o la renta
universal
mínima a las que
income
se
or
refiere el pilar
minimum
social
income.
europeo, es decir,
We're
cómo
talking about
financiamos
the
la protección
European
social
language.
y
How do
cómo
we
articulamos
fund
la
social
llegada de la
protections,
protección social
and
a
how
las
do we
personas. Y el
envision and
segundo debate, que
ensure
es el que yo
that people are able
voy
to
a
collect on
centrarme,
those
es
protections?
qué
The third
efectos
thing that I'd like to
produce sobre la
focus
seguridad
on
social o sobre la protección
is
social
what
la
is the impact
creación
of
de
Social
formas de empleo
Security in
derivadas
terms
del avance de
of
la tecnología.
the
Vean
creation
ustedes que
of
en mi
jobs based
slides,
on
como hacía antes
technology.
Cristina,
As you can
he
see on my
utilizado
slides,
la
as Christina
palabra
was saying,
nuevo entre
I
paréntesis,
keep
porque
using the
efectivamente
word
no
new, but
estoy
it's a
tan
quote
seguro de que
unquote.
estemos hablando,
And
o
I'm
no estoy
putting
tan
it
segura de
in
que estemos
parentheses
hablando de
here because
nuevas formas de
I'm
empleo,
saying
pero
this, I'm
sí
not sure
estoy
that these are
hay
really
un
new
cierto
forms
consenso de
of
que estas
employment,
formas de
but there
empleo
certainly is a
están
type
o
of
se derivan del
consensus
avance de la
that
tecnología.
these stem from progress in
Bien,
technology.
vuelvo otra vez a hablar de la vinculación entre empleo y protección social. Dado que la protección, perdón un momento, aquí. Dado que la protección social se ha creado fundamentalmente sobre el modelo de empleo, se ha creado también sobre el modelo de empleo dominante en nuestras sociedades. El empleo estándar, si quieren, que es el empleo dependiente, el empleo asalariado, el empleo indefinido o el empleo a tiempo completo. Claro, al avanzar a partir de los años 80 del siglo pasado, al avanzar fórmulas de empleo, por eso decía que no son tan nuevas, al avanzar fórmulas de empleo que se separaban de estas situaciones, de las situaciones del empleo estándar, la aparición de fórmulas de empleo autónomo, la aparición de fórmulas de empleo temporal o la aparición de fórmulas de empleo a tiempo parcial, el modelo de seguridad social ha tenido que ir adaptándose a esta aparición de formas de empleo no estándar. Yo no sé si las llamaría ya típicas o atípicas, porque al menos en mi país la gran mayoría del empleo que se crea en este momento tiene que ver con alguno de estos elementos, o es autónomo, o es temporal, o es a tiempo parcial. Pero sí que es cierto que este es el modelo sobre el que se construyó el propio modelo de seguridad social y de protección social. Pero efectivamente, al avanzar estas otras formas de empleo, ha habido que ir creando o ir adaptando el propio modelo de seguridad social. Y mi preocupación es que creo que no le hemos adaptado demasiado bien. Al tiempo que iban expandiéndose las formas de empleo diferentes a la estándar, íbamos produciendo adaptaciones pero al final esas adaptaciones creo que han producido una cierta desprotección social. Voy a utilizar cifras de la Unión Europea, pero quiero utilizarlas para que vean a lo que me estoy refiriendo. Hablando del empleo autónomo, en el ámbito de la Unión Europea, el 55% de los autónomos no tienen seguro de desempleo, el 38% de los trabajadores autónomos no tienen seguro de enfermedad y el 46% de las mujeres autónomas carecen de seguro de maternidad. Es decir, ese proceso de adaptación de la seguridad social desde el empleo estándar hacia fórmulas de empleo no estándar está produciendo situaciones de desprotección social muy importantes. Otro dato que pone encima de la mesa es lo que estoy diciendo. Según la agencia europea Eurofound, los autónomos, los trabajadores autónomos o los autónomos o los autoempleados o los emprendedores, como quieran ustedes llamarles, o los cuentapropistas, por utilizar la terminología propia de Latinoamérica, multiplican por 3,5 el riesgo de pobreza y exclusión social frente a los trabajadores asalariados, y 1 de cada 4 trabajador autónomo está en situación de pobreza o exclusión social. De hecho, hemos empezado a hablar en el ámbito de la Unión Europea de los autónomos vulnerables para referirnos a esta situación de pobreza o seguridad social. Quiero dejar bien claro, no me estoy refiriendo a falsos autónomos, no me estoy refiriendo a personas que están mal clasificadas como autónomos, me estoy refiriendo a personas que están bien clasificadas como trabajadores autónomos, pero cuyo nivel de rentas hace que estén en estas situaciones de pobreza o exclusión social. a hablar ya del trabajo en plataformas digitales, del que me vengo ocupando desde hace ya algún tiempo, pero quiero decirles que es quizá la fórmula de trabajo más conocida derivada de la tecnología, pero no es la única. No es la única porque están creciendo fórmulas de empleo que no conocíamos hasta el momento. Ahí he referido en mi slides algunas de ellas, los bloggers, que cada vez, o los influencers, por los que, por cierto, me preguntaron la última vez que estuve en Santiago de Chile, cuál podía ser la situación de los influencers y los bloggers de YouTube. Por cierto, en Europa hay un sindicato de youtubers también, los mineros de Bitcoin, que cada vez son, o de cualquier otra criptomoneda, y hay quienes entienden, y este es un debate que seguramente daremos en el futuro próximo, hay quienes entienden que deberíamos considerar una fórmula de empleo la provisión de datos a las grandes plataformas digitales, que a partir de esa provisión de datos deberían estas personas percibir una renta o un salario, y que por lo tanto esto debería considerarse como un empleo en la era digital. Bien, el empleo en plataformas, por centrarme en él, es el más atípico de todos, el menos estándar de todos, porque es autónomo. Voy a matizar ahora mismo esto que estoy diciendo: autónomo, es temporal y es a tiempo parcial. Es decir, tiene las tres características de lo no estándar. Y voy a detenerme en esto de lo autónomo, si es o no un empleo autónomo. La verdad es que, como saben, las plataformas digitales, la narrativa o el relato del que yo hablo de las plataformas digitales es bien diferente a los relatos o narrativas que conocíamos en el pasado. La plataforma no se presenta como una empresa a sí misma, de hecho compite con las empresas más clásicas. Las luchas y las peleas entre taxistas y conductores de Uber son típicas peleas entre fórmulas empresariales diferentes. Se presenta a sí misma como una intermediaria tecnológica, pero no como una empresa, y por lo tanto se presenta a sí misma como que no tiene trabajadores. Es lo que yo llamo la no empresa, el no trabajo. Ella no es una empresa, la plataforma se presenta como una empresa y por lo tanto no genera trabajo. Esto es cuestionable. Este relato se ha cuestionado en todos nuestros países, como diré después, pero este es el relato con el que se presenta la plataforma digital, y por lo tanto el bastión en el mundo del trabajo de la plataforma digital es: no tengo trabajo, tengo emprendedores. No soy una empresa, soy un mercado. En torno a mí hay prestadores de servicios que contactan o conectan con demandantes de servicios, y todo este modelo pasa por el modelo del freelancer o el modelo del emprendedor o el modelo del trabajador autónomo. Este es el relato de la plataforma. Por otra parte, la plataforma es muy disforme, no todas las plataformas son iguales. Hay plataformas que vemos que son visibles porque localizan geográficamente su trabajo. Uber es el ejemplo, o Globo, o Deliveroo, o Pedidos Ya, o Rappi son los ejemplos de este trabajo, pero hay plataformas online que expanden trabajo a lo largo del mundo y recogen trabajo a lo largo del mundo y pagan trabajo a lo largo del mundo. Con respecto a esta primera clasificación de las plataformas, sobre la que luego, si quieren, podemos volver, quiero hacer mi primera apreciación para pasar ya en los últimos minutos de mi intervención a la protección social. Los trabajadores de plataforma tienen una fuerte desprotección. Me gustaría enmarcar que la desprotección social de estos trabajadores de plataforma, lo hagan in situ o lo hagan online, no se produce por trabajar en plataforma. Y por eso he hecho tan especial hincapié en la narrativa de la plataforma, sino que se producen porque estas personas que trabajan por medio de plataformas lo hacen con una fórmula que tiene una menor protección social, que es el trabajo autónomo. La precariedad no la produce la plataforma. La precariedad se produce y la desprotección social se produce porque se utiliza una fórmula de trabajo, que es el trabajo autónomo o el cuentapropista, que tiene una muy fuerte, muy intensa, menor protección que el trabajo asalariado o que el trabajo por cuenta ajena. Esta es la clave con la que tenemos que afrontar la protección social de las personas con plataforma o de otras tantas personas que trabajan digitalmente, aunque no lo hagan a través de una plataforma, sino que son estos empleos a los que antes me he referido. La clave clave no es el medio a través del que trabajan, la clave es que en ese medio se trabaja de forma autónoma y la protección social del trabajo autónomo es inferior, muy inferior a la del trabajo por cuenta ajena o la del trabajo dependiente. Bien, si esto avanza, ¿qué sucederá? Y yo aquí, si ven, mi slide se titula "Es un fenómeno global que exige respuestas globales", porque las plataformas no están solo en Uruguay, o están en Chile, o están en España, o en Portugal, o en Italia. Las plataformas son un fenómeno global. La tecnología permite que sean un fenómeno global. Y los fenómenos globales requieren respuestas globales. Es verdad que las consideraciones nacionales sobre cómo proteger el trabajo en plataformas son importantes y esenciales, pero hasta que no haya una decisión internacional y global sobre el trabajo en plataformas, será muy difícil aproximarse al empleo y a la protección social de este tipo de trabajadores, porque las distintas regulaciones nacionales ejercen una especie de arbitraje donde se sitúan las plataformas. Y aquí me gustaría hablar de dos soluciones que se han esbozado en el marco global. La primera, la europea, la del Pilar Europeo de Derechos Sociales. En el Pilar Europeo de Derechos Sociales se dice que todos los trabajadores, sean por cuenta propia o sean por cuenta ajena, deben de tener el derecho a una protección social adecuada. Este Pilar Europeo de Derechos Sociales ha sido desarrollado mediante la recomendación del Consejo de noviembre del 2019 relativa al acceso a la protección social para los trabajadores por cuenta ajena y por cuenta propia, donde dice expresamente que todos los trabajadores, sean trabajadores autónomos o sean trabajadores dependientes, tienen que tener la misma protección social. Tienen que tener un nivel adecuado de protección social. ¿Qué sucede con esta recomendación? Como tantas veces en el ámbito de la Unión Europea, que avanza a la vanguardia, pero después se queda como hacia la mitad. Y es que esta recomendación, como su nombre indica, es una regla de soft law, es una regla no vinculante para los Estados miembros, y además no está vinculado a ningún sistema de monitorización en el ámbito de la Unión Europea. Es decir, que no está dentro de las reglas de la Unión Europea que si se incumplen provocan sanciones para los países o los miembros de la Unión Europea que lo sepan. Pero dicho esto, hay otro elemento más importante que hay que considerar cuando hablamos de todas estas situaciones y el por qué la Unión Europea se ha planteado ya equiparar la situación de los trabajadores dependientes de los trabajadores y de los trabajadores asalariados. Y es porque la Unión Europea ha entrado en este camino, porque la Unión Europea está viendo que sus sistemas de protección social tienen un riesgo cierto de sostenibilidad si avanza el modelo de las plataformas digitales o avanza este modelo basado en el empleo autónomo. ¿Por qué? Porque, como bien saben ustedes, los autónomos tienen una menor cotización a la seguridad social. Habitualmente es habitual que coticen menos a la seguridad social que los asalariados. Y además, en muchas ocasiones, ni siquiera por la cuantía de su renta cotizan a la seguridad social. Y, sin embargo, generan prestaciones cuando aparecen los riesgos respecto a estos trabajadores. Por eso la Unión Europea ha sido como muy proactiva en el marco de cómo proteger el trabajo de plataformas digitales, no tanto porque le guíe un afán de altruismo con respecto a estos trabajadores, que probablemente puede ser que sí, pero fundamentalmente porque el avance en la plataforma digital está poniendo en riesgo, en serio riesgo, la sostenibilidad de nuestros sistemas de seguridad social. En el marco de la OIT, lo tengo controlado. ¿Y qué pasa en la OIT? Cristina ha estado muy generosa porque efectivamente ha hablado de que en la declaración del centenario de la OIT habla de un acceso universal a la protección social completa y sostenible. Pero creo que en el debate que hubo entre el informe de la comisión de expertos, que directamente hablaba de que había que garantizar una protección universal a los trabajadores autónomos y a los trabajadores dependientes sin que hubiera una diferencia, y la
to
declaración del centenario
self-employed
hubo algo que se
workers.
perdió por el camino.
And
Porque
between
en la
that and
declaración
the
del centenario de la
declaration
OIT, con
of the centenary,
toda la importancia que tiene la
with all of
declaración
the
del centenario de
importance
la OIT,
of that
finalmente
declaration,
solo exclusivamente se dijo
the fact
que
is
era necesario
that
que hubiera un acceso a una
we needed
seguridad
to
social
ensure
completa y sostenible,
access
pero ni
to
siquiera se
complete and
hizo
sustainable
mención, ni siquiera se
social
hizo
protections,
referencia
but there's
a
no
que
reference, no
el empleo
mention
autónomo pudiera tener
to
este mismo derecho al acceso universal
self-employed
y sostenible a la
workers
seguridad
and their
social.
right
Es
to
decir,
that
que en el camino
same level of
entre
protections. In other
el
words,
comité de expertos y la
someplace between
declaración
the
del
Committee of
centenario
Experts
de
and the ILO Centenary
la
Declaration for the
OIT,
Future of
hubo
Work,
una especie de pérdida,
there was
porque ahí se
something
perdió la
got lost
oportunidad,
in
y esta es una
translation.
opinión propia, se
And
perdió
again,
la
this is my
oportunidad
own
de que
personal
la propia
opinion.
declaración del centenario
We
de la OIT
missed the
hablara de una
opportunity
seguridad
to
social
have the
equiparable
ILO
para
Centenary
trabajadores
Declaration
autónomos y para trabajadores
to
dependientes,
refer
porque recuerden que ahí
specifically
está la
to
clave
dependent and
de la
independent
desprotección
workers.
social del trabajo
Because
en
let's
plataforma.
remember that is
Son
the
trabajadores
key to
autónomos
these lack of
y tienen
protections.
una menor
It is
protección social. Si la
independent workers,
protección social de
self-employed
los
workers
autónomos y
who
de los
are
dependientes
less
fuera
well protected.
equiparable,
Now,
vamos
if
a
we
dejarlo en
could
la
level
palabra
that playing
equiparable,
field, if it
la
were
desprotección
even
social
and
sería
fair,
mucho menor. Si
then
quieren que comparta con
obviously
ustedes mi
there
opinión,
would be
creo,
a lot
siempre lo he pensado
less
y Fabio lo
of
sabe,
a
que
divergence
en el
there.
marco de la OIT
I would like to
sería
just
el marco
close on
excelente
this.
o el mejor
Fabio
marco, el
knows, and of
best
course, that the
escenario
ILO would be
para
a wonderful
regular el
scenario,
trabajo en
a
plataformas
wonderful
digitales,
place
tanto en el marco de
to
los derechos
be able
laborales
to
como en el
regulate
marco de la
both
protección
all
social.
of these
Y
things,
voy ya a mi
both for
última
dependent
slide.
and independent workers. And my final slide,
Esta es la última slide que comparto con ustedes.
that I will
Y es
share
que
with you. And
digamos que para intentar que haya una mejor protección social del trabajo en plataforma, he clasificado tres posibilidades. La primera posibilidad, a la que ya ha aludido Cristina, es la clasificación de los trabajadores que trabajan por la vía de la plataforma como trabajadores dependientes y aplicar la seguridad social del trabajo de los dependientes. La segunda es, y por eso esa fue mi primera slide, desacoplar la protección social del empleo, es decir, hacer que la protección social se parezca más al modelo nórdico que a los modelos continentales europeos y latinoamericanos. Y la tercera es una reflexión que dejo para el final porque sorprende mucho, y es que creo que las plataformas deberían pagar las cotizaciones a la seguridad social de todos los trabajadores, sean dependientes o sean autónomos. Pero como quedan todavía unos minutos de intervención, voy a intentar entrar en las tres alternativas. Bien, como saben, en su país, en Uruguay, Chile, en Francia, en Estados Unidos, se ha intentado reconducir este tema a través de los tribunales y a través de la declaración como trabajadores asalariados de las personas que trabajan en plataformas digitales. También en España. También en España, donde acabamos de tener una sentencia del Tribunal Supremo que luego, si quieren, podemos comentar bueno, yo no tengo nada, soy laboralista, nada que oponer a esto que yo llamo modelo clásico de obtener protección social y obtener derechos laborales, nada que oponer. Pero es cierto que, y estos son quizá los puntos débiles, en primer lugar, solo se manejan los indicios de una parte del trabajo en plataforma, del trabajo que vemos, pero no sabemos si esos mismos indicios se dan o no en el trabajo en plataforma que no vemos. Por cierto, si les sirve el referente, en España, que es el primer país de la Unión Europea en trabajo en plataforma digital, la mayor parte de los trabajadores no trabajan en el delivery, trabajan a través de plataformas digitales que no vemos, haciendo traducción de papers, diseño de software, diseño de páginas web, y no sé, y esta es una duda que yo comparto con ustedes, si los indicios de existencia de contrato de trabajo que se están manejando respecto de las plataformas in situ son los mismos que podríamos manejar o no. Y repito, soy laboralista respecto de estos trabajadores de plataformas hoy. En segundo lugar, y bien, ¿y si fueran autónomos de verdad? ¿Y cómo protegemos a los autónomos de verdad con este modelo clásico? Porque ahí, ¿y si hay verdaderos autónomos? Entonces decimos, bueno, protegemos a los trabajadores dependientes cuando ganan, pero a los autónomos no los protegemos, o los protegemos menos, porque son autónomos. Es decir, generamos nosotros mismos con este modelo una fuerte desprotección del genuino trabajo autónomo si es que existiera y si pudiera darse en la plataforma. Yo creo que existe y puede darse en función de las circunstancias a través de las que se trabaja la plataforma. No todas las plataformas son lo mismo, no todas las plataformas tienen las mismas características y por lo tanto puede haber una diferencia en este sentido. En mi país, en España, se creó una tercera figura. Se creó el trabajo económicamente dependiente al que se adjudicaron unos derechos como a mitad de camino entre el trabajo asalariado y el trabajo autónomo. Entonces nos preguntamos también si esta podría ser una posible solución, crear esta figura del trabajo autónomo económicamente dependiente. La experiencia española ha sido un fracaso, un auténtico fracaso. Si quieren, luego les cuento por qué. Y también quiero decirles que yo fui una de las redactoras del Estatuto del Trabajo Autónomo y por lo tanto una de las redactoras de la figura y no ha sido valiosa, o por lo menos hasta la fecha no ha sido valiosa para adjudicar protección social. Y por último, como les decía, en España acabamos de tener una sentencia y acabamos de abrir diálogo social para ver cómo clasificamos a los trabajadores de las plataformas digitales con un nuevo concepto que si quieren luego comentamos, que es el concepto de dependencia implícita o dependencia indirecta de los trabajadores de plataforma. No voy a entrar en el modelo de desacoplar la protección social del empleo porque creo que Cristina lo ha hecho de forma verdaderamente brillante, así que yo estoy caminando por este camino, por el camino de desacoplar la protección social del empleo, pero lo dejamos para otra discusión si quieren, porque quiero en este último minuto decirles cuál es mi propuesta. Mi propuesta es que el primer punto de partida es que nuestros modelos de seguridad social no son algo ontológico, son una construcción jurídica. Se han convertido después en construcciones culturales, pero es una construcción jurídica. Una construcción jurídica que se basó en una reflexión probablemente basada en la ideología o en el mundo de los valores que cada cual tuviera en cada momento, sobre cómo distribuir los riesgos de que se producían en la actividad productiva del modelo económico capitalista. Y entonces se llegó a un consenso, que es que los riesgos los asumían directamente los empleadores, en el caso de los trabajadores dependientes, y los asumían los propios trabajadores autónomos.
And consensus, because the risks were usually taken on
by
by the employees. I think it's time to rethink and reflect on whether this risk distribution that was done at some point continues to be valuable or not in this world of technological and digital platforms where there is a provision of public services, but I believe that is what we are reflecting on, that is where the advance, the progress of digital platforms should move towards, and with a certain independence, including the legal status of labor, whether it is as dependent or self-employed, and all workers must have the same rights and the same rights to social protection. And of course, the same pensions. Platforms must pay these contributions of independent workers or self-employed workers. It is not a solution that doesn't exist already. It does. In the Portuguese model in Portugal, people are working autonomously or independently. The employer that they work for over 50% of their time is paid for. The employer, pays into the system. India, the same thing. This means, and I'll conclude with this, that we don't necessarily need to rethink the social protection system. It would be the same one. We don't need to rethink work as a formula or as an institution through which we would distribute labor rights. It would continue to be the same. We need to rethink the social risk distribution for the platforms, and this would be the new system. They would need to be the ones who would pay for social protection. That's all. Thank you. Thank you, Luz, for your reflections and suggestions for the debate. I need to ask the interpreters to make a modification in the channel. Actually, it is not something that the interpreters can do. The listeners need to select English without the original language. We will now hear from Slavina Spasova, who will talk about the access to pension benefits for non-standard workers and the self-employed in the European Union. You have the floor.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that you will find my presentation useful for your reflections at the Commission of Social Security in Uruguay. I will focus on access to pension benefits for non-standard workers and the self-employed in the European Union. My talk will consist of 3 parts. I will first focus on formal access, so access by law for non-standard workers and the self-employed. Then I will move to effective access and adequacy of pension benefits for these workers. And finally, I will provide you with some brief insights on some recent reforms and also with some further reflections for better access to pensions for these categories of workers. Let me now start with the formal access to pensions. I have some preliminary remarks on terminology. Here I will focus only on pay-as-you-go pensions. According to the terminology, to research, we can have different terms about these pensions: first pillar pensions, statutory pensions, as it's now used from the European Commission in the Pension Adequacy Report. And I'll also provide you with some insights on occupational pensions, and I'll explain why I do that later on. As for non-standard workers, we already had the presentation from Christina. Here I focus on the same definition from the ILO. So these are all workers which are not in full-time open-ended contracts. And then as for the self-employed, when I mention self-employed, I refer normally to self-employed with or without employees. So this the so-called solo self-employed. And depending on what I'm talking about, sometimes I will also refer to dependent self-employed, which are in some countries of the European Union a separate category, which is recognized by law. And these are mostly people, depending on the country legislation, working for a single client, something like between 70 or 85% of their time. So these are the preliminary remarks before I start my presentation. Let me now continue with formal access for non-standard workers. In general, in all the EU countries, non-standard workers have formal access to pay-as-you-go pensions as standard workers. So they are not excluded, like in some cases they could be for unemployment benefits, for sickness benefits, for occupational injuries benefits. However, formal access may differ depending on some specific categories of non-standard workers. Like, for instance, in some countries, not so many in the European Union, some apprentices and trainees do not have access to pension systems. Well, we can say, okay, we are not supposed to stay a long time in apprenticeship or in traineeship, but what we see since 2008, since the big economic crisis, is that people are accumulating more and more this kind of traineeships, and then sometimes for 2-3 years, and during these years in some countries, they just don't build up pension entitlements, and this is very important to know. And then access may also differ depending on some specific categories of non-standard workers, and could be the insurance can be voluntary. There could be opt-in, opt-outs, depending on as I said, on the category, but also on the income thresholds. And there could be also different eligibility conditions for some people in non-standard workers. And in Europe, these are mostly seasonal workers, on-call workers, temporary agent ones, and some country-specific categories, such as mini jobbers in in Germany, marginal part-timers in Austria, and also people working on civil contracts in several Central and Eastern European countries. So these are contracts based on the civil code and not on the labor code. And so they don't have the same access to social protection and to labor protection as those working on labor codes. And here I also provide the example with temporary agency workers in the Netherlands. There is a double condition for these agency workers based on the employer's liability and on the contribution period. So if you are a temporary agency worker in the Netherlands, in order to access pension benefits, you have to have a contract with the same employer for at least 26 weeks. So these are the kind of specific conditions for some people in non-standard employment. And here, to refer to Maria Sluz's presentation, some of these people, for instance, on-call people, could be in the platform economy. But these are the overall rules on access to pensions. As for the self-employed, again, in the European Union, the self-employed have formal access to pay-as-you-go pensions as salaried workers in general. They are not excluded from access to pensions as they could be excluded from access to unemployment benefits in 14 European member states. They could be excluded from access to sickness benefits in 3 European member states and from access to occupational injuries benefits. So they're not excluded from access to pensions. And even in 25 out of the 27 new member states, they are mandatorily insured to pensions. Although there are several differences, again, depending on the category of the self-employed and on income thresholds. And here I'll give you, for instance, the example with Romania, although there have been some reforms, and I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. So in Romania, the dependent self-employed with a single client benefit from compulsory pension insurance, and the client is required to pay contributions equivalent to those of an employer. And the rest of the self-employed have voluntary insurance. Also in some countries, and this is quite specific for the Southern European welfare model, there are several specific schemes for the self-employed, and this could be for liberal professions, for farmers. This is also true for the Nordic countries and for some of the Eastern European countries like Poland, where the farmers make up an important part of the self-employed. And in 2 countries of the European Union, there is a voluntary insurance by default for the self-employed. This is in Germany and the Netherlands. While I still have to tell you that in Germany, only some categories of the self-employed are compulsorily insured. And these are the dependent self-employed without employees and some artists and publishers. The rest can insure in different schemes of pensioner reserves and can also transfer can also be insured in some specific pension schemes, allowing formerly salaried workers to be insured. And here I would like to say that, for instance, Germany has been integrating their dependent self-employed and some categories of the self-employed since 1999 into the statutory pension system. So there have been important reforms going on in some countries. Let me now focus on the implications of these formal rules for effective access and adequacy of benefits. And effective access, here I mean the possibility to build up pension entitlements. Again, for the non-standard workers, what are the issues? They are much less than for the self-employed. In general, voluntary insurance might lead to many workers deciding not to join or to opt out, and thus they build less entitlements to pension systems. In general, the issues with non-standard workers and the pension system is also these frequently interrupted shorter careers and lower earnings of their lower earnings, which also leads to much lower benefits for them. And you already referred in your presentations, the gender gap in pensions is still very important. And the theoretical replacement rates show that it will remain very important in 50 years. And so here we could see that it's particularly problematic for people in non-standard workers, like for instance in the Austrian and German cases, most workers employed on in marginal part-time work are women, so their pension entitlements will be quite low in the future and are low now. The issues with the self-employed are, as I said, more numerous than for non-standard workers. First of all, what we could see in our studies on pensions and self-employment is that voluntary insurance, again, the same thing as for non-standard workers, may bring to many self-employed not joining the system or opting out of the system. And I will provide you some very interesting examples on that afterwards. The problem could be also linked to eligibility conditions tailored for salaried employment, which didn't evolve in some countries, for instance, linked to contributory periods. One of the main issues with the self-employed, and not only regarding pensions, is also the inadequate assessment base taken into account for the calculation of benefits. It could be linked to income paid on previous long period of earnings, upfront payments, payments of arrears, and for sure under and non-reporting of income streams. And this is a particular problem in Central and Eastern Europe. And here what we could see is that countries are moving and discussing this issue, and they're trying to go into the direction, some countries, of taking into account the current income of the self-employed. And here it's very important when a system is designed for the self-employed, as Maria said, and now there is a very good article from Post-Hawkins on digital workers and social security, which just was published. These people on platforms are most likely to be in independent employment. And so here, when a system is designed or reform, is very important to take into account also the assessment base. Then another issue could be also linked to contribution rates. They could be too low, regressive. There could be ceilings, like in Belgium, for instance. The contribution rates for the self-employed are regressive depending on their revenue, and at the end, they end up with quite low pension entitlements. And then it was already discussed by Christina, the transferability of entitlements between labor market statuses might be very problematic in many countries. The transferability, the probability, and the portability. And then here are some good examples, like in Germany, there are individual accounts. There is also, since not a long time, there's also some reforms in the French system which go into this direction. And finally, and this is also very important for the self-employed when designing the pension systems, are the career breaks, which may affect the pension entitlements of the self-employed more than those of salaried workers. For instance, let's take the unemployment benefits. I said in 14 European countries, the self-employed are excluded from unemployment benefits. So if they fall into unemployment, they often fall into social assistance benefits, and so they cannot build up pension entitlements based on their unemployment benefits, on the replacement of their previous income. So this is also very important in the design of the pension systems for the self-employed. And so let's see now how these issues for the self-employed are translated into data. And here I borrowed this graph from the pension adequacy report. You could see here the relative difference in the median equalized disposable income between retired employees and retired self-employed. This comes from the pension adequacy report from 2018. It was the first time that this was done, that we had data about this. I suppose that in the pension adequacy report 2021, there will be all the countries. Here we do not have all the countries, but let's have a look. First of all, we could see that in the EU, the percentage, the difference between the retirement income of self-employed and the retired employees is 20%. So the self-employed have 20% less than the retired employees. And if we have a look at the countries, we see that the major differences in Poland, but then Poland is followed by quite affluent democracies such as Luxembourg, Denmark, France, Finland, and we were talking about the inclusion of self-employed into the universal systems of Nordic countries. Why is this so? And I will come back to that afterwards, referring to occupational pensions and the importance of occupational pensions in these countries. And here are some more concrete examples than this abstract data linked to how these issues translate into reality. In Romania, for instance, only 10 to 11% of the self-employed are covered for old age benefits because most of them at least had up until last year voluntary access. So they just decide not to join. In Italy, in 2010, a self-employed had a gross replacement rate of 77% of pensions, and the rate for salaried employers were 73%. In 2040, it is estimated, these are projections, that this retirement income would be respectively 47% for the self-employed and 61% for the employees. Well, one of the explanations are that the world of work is changing, as you explained, and so the self-employed are not anymore these affluent liberal professions. So there are many vulnerable self-employed who insure themselves on the minimum income basis in the country. And here we see also the Spanish case. It was estimated that the average monthly base for the self-employed is approximately 36% lower than for the salaried workers. And it's estimated that 86% of the self-employed are insured on this minimum contribution base. We can imagine the adequacy of benefits for these people. And there are several examples, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, which go into this direction. Here I would like to very briefly refer to some insights on the role of occupational pensions, especially in Nordic countries. And they are extremely important. They are an important part of pension entitlements in some countries. And unfortunately, the self-employed are mostly not covered at all by these occupational pensions, which are based on the dialogue normally between the employer and the trade unions. And another issue with these pensions is the transferability of their entitlements between statuses when people change statuses. And for instance, in 2017, the Netherlands have established a specific collective schemes for the self-employed, facilitating transferability. Finally, in the previous presentations, you slightly referred to bogus self-employment. We don't have data, and this is very difficult to estimate, but it is likely to be lower, even much lower, than among the benefits of these people than among standard workers, as employers use this form of employment to avoid paying social contributions. And let me finish with some insights on reforms, because things have been moving in several countries. And we, from the European Social Policy Network, we contribute to the pension adequacy report of the European Commission, especially on reforms. And here I will provide you with some insights, for instance, in Belgium. In Belgium, you should know that Belgium has been having a very long process of harmonization of the status of the self-employed and the social protection status of the self-employed and the salaried workers, especially with regards to pensions. And finally, in 2017, the minimum pension for the self-employed increased significantly, aligned with the minimum pensions for the employees. In Spain, but this information should be still confirmed because we still have the draft reports. There have been a series of improvements which were made in 2018 and 2019 to the special regime for the self-employed, expected to result in more adequate pensions in the future. I think it was a question of replacement rates. And then in Portugal created a new contributory regime for the self-employed. So they decreased their contributory rates and brought them closer to those of contractual workers, expecting that this would end up in more access more insurance coverage for these workers. And then I just talked about occupational pensions. Since 2018, the Luxembourgish government enlarged the scope of occupational pensions to the self-employed. So they now have could create occupational pensions, as we said, as we saw in the graph I show you. Luxembourg was the third country where there was a huge difference between the self-employed and the non-standard and the salaried workers. And then finally, two last examples on countries which granted access to the statutory pension system for some categories which were excluded before. So first, this is Lithuania. And then in 2016, notaries, clerks, and lawyers in Romania can opt in to the pension system voluntarily. And in addition, as of 2016, all the self-employed in Romania are required to be insured, but it depends again on their income. So it's not sure that they will end up being insured. Non-standard workers, some further...
Slavina, 3, 4, 5 minutes?
Yes, this is my last slide.
Okay,
yeah.
Good.
So on the non-standard workers, some reflection on how to improve their access is that frequently interrupted shorter careers and lower earnings of these workers could be counteracted by specific accrual conditions in the pension system, like pension credits for child rearing, unemployment benefits, etc. Specific elements in the pension formula, in calculation and proportionality with, for instance, standard workers, etc., and counting interrupted contribution periods as in the career length of for pensions. Another possibility would be, when it exists, this kind of waiting periods to allow people to contribute from the day one they start work. As for the self-employed, one of the most important recommendations is to have a clearly defined contribution base, to have less possibility for voluntary insurance, because evidence shows that they end up not really well insured when insurance is voluntary, to have better transferability of entitlements, and to have transparency, access to information, and less administrative burden. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to welcome your feedback. Thanks.
Bien, muchas gracias, Slavina, por el panorama
Thank you very much, Slavina,
de los trabajadores no estándar, los trabajadores
this review of independent and salaried workers in Europe. I think a lot of what you have discussed are very similar to the conversations that we've had here in the South, particularly in Uruguay as well. Certainly there has been significant progress in covering these independent and self-employed workers, but there are questions as to how to close these gaps and be able to make these career paths more similar, particularly those who have more varied experiences in the non-traditional categories. Rodolfo, we are 3 minutes out from our closing time. The idea is that we should be able to have a Q&A session later just with the commission. So perhaps I would like to give you the floor, Rodolfo, to see if we can close out our open seminar on that note. Before that, I would like to thank Guillermo Montt for coordinating the panel, this seminar. And therefore, Rodolfo, I will give you the floor to wrap up this open YouTube session. Thank you, Fabio. Thank you to our 3 speakers as well. It's been very interesting, and there have been a lot of things to think about, tremendous food for thought. I think that since our time is up for this first part of our activity, we should go ahead and do that. And then move on to a Q&A session. I certainly do have questions for the second phase rather of our activity this morning. Very well. We will then just simply thank our audience for joining us on YouTube, and we will take a 30-minute break and then come back in our room at noon Santiago time for our Q&A session with our 3 speakers, and of course with the ILO team to be able to address the topics of interest and of concern. So thank you very much, Rodolfo. Thank you, Mario. We can then wrap up that YouTube transmission, and we will come back and meet again at the same room in half an hour. 30-minute break. Thank you very much.